No moi kaikki! It's your master of ceremonies, Mikko, at it again. I guess my coworkers are still too busy to appear in these videos, so I had to make another one. This one is also based on an old slideshow. I think this was originally presented to batch Fin 6 back in the day, so it's very old, but it's also about a very important person who is not particularly old. And her name is Minna Canth. She was a playwright and an author and a journalist and an entrepreneur and a mother of 7 in Finland in the 1800s. She has her dedicated Flag Day in Finland on March 19, and Flag Day in Finnish context means that state offices are mandated to and individuals are encouraged to fly the Finnish flag on that day. And March 19 was chosen because it was her birthday, and it is known in Finland as Minna Canthin päivä, tasa-arvon päivä, literally the day of equality, although in Finnish context it's maybe best translated as equity. Anyway, in Finnish her name would be pronounced Minna Canth, but I don't want this video to be flagged by YouTube profanity filter or something, so I will be intentionally mispronouncing her last name throughout the video as Minna Canth. But obviously use the correct pronunciation when you talk about her in Finland in Finnish. So Canth was one of the most famous Finnish authors in the 1800s and basically of all time. And in her time, literally realism was a big deal in Finland, or it was emerging in Finland. And bulk, although not all of her works can be labeled as realistic or representatives of realism. And when I say realism, I mean realism in the sense of literature, literary realism, a genre where the reality or the subject matter is like presented or represented truthfully, and it's like often seen as a reaction to general disappointment in the repertoire offered by Romanticism, and it was also fueled by notions of social inequality, and especially in Central Europe, the fact that the fruits of the Industrial Revolution did not really trickle down. And in Finland, goals were also very similar: women's rights and universal suffrage, and as well as like the position of tenant farmers in the Finnish society before the civil war in 1918. Though in Finland realism remains mainstream in literature way beyond Minna Canth all the way to the 1950s, but she was a pioneer in that, especially in Finnish theater. And she was the second major Finnish playwright after Aleksis Kivi, who's the national author of Finland, and wrote the first Finnish novel in the Finnish language called Seitsemän veljestä, or Seven Brothers. Now, Canth was also a pioneer in Finnish journalism. She wrote articles, opinion pieces, and fiction. They were initially published in 2 newspapers where her husband worked as an editor. Here's a few or brief bullet points about her life. So she was born in Tampere as Ulrika Wilhelmina Jonsson in 1844. She was essentially a city girl through her entire life, although the term city might be a little misleading here, since there were like 3,000 people living in Tampere at the time. But the family later moved to Kuopio as her father started to run a business there. Kuopio is here. And in Kuopio, the family was pretty well off and could afford to send Minna and her siblings to school. rather than needing them helpers at their shop. So Minna continued her schooling there, first in Finnish, then later on she moved to another school where instruction was in Swedish. So she kind of received a more thorough education than a working class person normally would at the time. In 1863, with her parents' approval and encouragement, she went to Jyväskylä, where the government had just started a school teacher training program. And at the time, it was one of the few professions that a woman could have in order to support herself independently, like financially. School teacher, that is. But 2 years into her studies, she got married to one of her teachers, Johan Ferdinand Canth, and dropped out of training. The couple settled down in Jyväskylä, and they had 7 children. And at the same time, Canth worked as a journalist and published her first book in 1878. And her husband died in 1879, and Canth and the kids moved to Kuopio a year later in 1880 to take over the shop that her father had left behind when he had died in 1877. So she got the business back up and running, and their financial situation was stable, so she not only had more time for writing, but was also able to acquire books and materials from abroad. So she was able to read German, Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian, and possibly some French. So she was like very, very up to date as to what the trends and new ideas going around in Europe were at the time. She would attract others like her, like people interested in literature and culture and new ideas, and her home and the city of Kuopio in general became kind of like a cultural hub where contemporary university students and authors and artists would go and meet and discuss and share ideas. Canth herself was not really fond of traveling, and she loved it in Kuopio, but was very keenly following the world around her. And she was very inspiring conversationalist and like very open about her ideas. She would publicly discuss them, and she would also discuss her works that she is writing, and sometimes to a point where her fellow journalist friends would like mention the upcoming works way too early in their newspapers and so on. She died of a heart attack in May 12, 1897. Historically, Canth has often been portrayed as kind of like controversial figure who was like pushing her agenda of women's rights with all her time and energy, and would be presented in this setting of mighty Minna versus the patriarchy. But this is obviously like very one-dimensional, and portraying anyone as a warrior for just one cause can be off-putting. And this kind of public image that like has been presented of her in early biographies, it has hurt her public image in the past. While she did have stark opinions and views that were like indeed controversial at the time, that was not her entire character, and nor would she just steamroll over everybody who disagreed. She was a good and inspiring conversationalist, and she was already well respected in her time by fellow artists and people who knew her. And even people who didn't really like her plays or other written works, they would find it intriguing to discuss with her in person. So here are some of the things that she's often found controversial for. So Canth was a devout Christian, but also supported religious freedom as well as separation of church and state. This did not really sit well with Lutheran Church in Finland at the time, especially with conservative clergy when combined with their idea that like women should not receive higher education or it's too much for them or stuff like that. And at the time, Canth insisted that no sex before marriage for both men and women, and this put her on a collision course with another famous Finnish author, Juhani Aho, who thought that no, it's okay for men to have sex before marriage, but that's not okay for women, like an obvious double standard there. But well, Mr. Aho also lived together with his wife and the wife's sister, and he had kids with both of them, so I guess he was a bit more liberal in that regard. And as journalist, Canth would write articles about negative effects of smoking and alcohol. This did not really sit well with one of her employers, as the newspaper was funded by a booze distillery, so Canth was fired from that job. And at the time, it was thought, or there was like prevailing social ethos that family's assets would belong to the husband, and he'd do whatever he wanted with them. And Kant obviously disagreed, and this is very clearly brought up in one of her most radical plays, which is called Työmiehen vaimo from 1885. And she supported women's emancipation in general, but that was not really her only agenda in life, and often when people talk about her, this overshadows her literary accomplishments and life as a successful business owner. So don't forget about those aspects as well. Now I've chosen 3 very controversial works to be shown here, but during her career she published 10 plays and 7 other books and various short stories, as well as newspaper articles and speeches. And many of her works discuss and criticize like social injustice in Finland at the time, and they would be met with like various levels of both praise and criticism. And one of the most controversial of these works is the aforementioned Työmiehen vaimo, literally worker's wife or workman's wife, from 1885. It's a play where the main character Johanna is married to a drunkard called Risto, and when after they get married, it turns out that Risto is just this loser who drinks all the money Johanna has earned for them, and he's also trying to hit on another woman. And the play criticized both alcoholism or alcohol, as well as like men having way more power over their partner in marriage legislation wise. In 1886, Canth published a book called Hanna. It is about a woman who wants to focus on studying or her career, but her parents really do not think that that's suitable for a woman. And when she finds a love interest, he cheats on Hanna with a prostitute and then goes on to marry another woman. So in this regard, the play criticizes the prevalent double standard that I already mentioned, where sexual activeness before marriage was seen okay for men but not for women. The name of the book refers to a book of the same name by Mr. Runeberg, whom I mentioned in another video, the national poet. And while Runeberg's Hanna kind of represents romanticism and is very idealized, Hanna by Minna Canth ends in a very different tone and has a totally unhappy ending and represents realism rather than romanticism in literature. But the two books, they do not cover the same subject matter, so the only connection is the name here. Her very controversial works end in 1888 with a play Kovan onnen lapsia. This thing was such shock therapy to the audience that the theater that premiered it, they cancelled further shows right after the premiere. So it attacks the contemporary social order very harshly, and by social order I mean the estate-based or class-based society, and the status of the poor is in the limelight of this one. So like I mentioned, the premiere was a scandal. The audience was so upset that the play had to be interrupted, and some people tried to spread rumors that there was a bomb in the theater in order to get people to leave. And the theater also was told by the government that we will cancel all monetary assistance to you if you perform this play for another time, and they did not. The theater was Suomalainen Teatteri, and Canth was so furious about that she wrote her next play in Swedish. And later on, some students publicly burned her books in Hämeenlinna, in the city of Hämeenlinna, which I guess does not really happen that much in Finland to anyone after or before that. Anyway, so her works are now public domain, so you can go and read them in Finnish for free, at least, and see it for yourself. And the three works that I highlighted here, they are not her entire career by any means. Her later books or works are less radical, but still have the same social commentary to them. And the contemporaries regarded many, despite the criticism, her contemporaries regarded many of Canth's works as masterpieces already at the time. It was like the older generations who would have a hard time with these or would find these upsetting. And her works also did bring forward social change in Finland, so her legacy is way more than just sitting at home in Kuopio and causing cultural scandals. She was also entertaining these wannabe cosmopolitans, was following the world around her, and her legacy carries on. As I mentioned, March 19 is the Day of Equality and Minna Canth in Finland. She has streets named after her in several cities, and she also has various statues and other memorials across the country. The most famous statues are in the three cities where she lived, so in Tampere and Jyväskylä and Kuopio. Here are some pictures. Now, unfortunately, there is no pastry associated with her flag day, unlike there is for Mr. Runeberg in the other video, which you should totally check. But you can celebrate by reading her plays, being interested in the world around you, in new ideas, furthering equality and in the society, and just having civilized conversations with people where you listen to one another respectfully. So there. Okay, hey, if you got any questions, ask me on Discord. Ja hyvää Minna Canthin päivää. Happy Minna Canth Day. Nähdään. Moi moi.